What do you swear you saw, but have no proof? I was staying for a week at a guest house on some property up in the middle of nowhere, Washington State. I'm sitting on the porch early in the morning, drinking a cup of coffee, and I see a young deer in the yard about 20 yards from me. So I just stay still and take it in. Then along comes this rabbit hopping in, and they notice each other. The rabbit hops up toward the deer, and the deer cautiously puts its nose toward the rabbit. The rabbit gets up on its hind legs, and they slowly inch their noses closer and closer to each other. Then they touch, and the deer hops straight up in the air. The rabbit runs in a full circle around the deer and then stops. Then they repeated the exact same thing. They did this like 3 times, then ran back into the woods together. This was before cell phones, and I'm glad it was. It was just something for me and me only, and I am grateful for it. Back in 1995, I was sitting on the beach in Durban, South Africa, with a bunch of mates after a night out. The sun was just starting to come up, and a dolphin launched itself out of the water. For less than a second, it was silhouetted in front of the rising sun, and then it was gone. Nobody else saw it, but it is an image that is burned into my mind and will no doubt stay with me for the rest of my life. When I was 10, we had a 14-year-old German Shepherd who was getting very sick. I was home alone momentarily as my mom went to the neighbors to pick up a book or something. Our German Shepherd came over, convinced me to walk outside with him, and started licking my hands. He looked at me and then ran away, jumping the fence, and he never came back. He was so loyal and good that to this day, no one believes me and thinks he was stolen because he would never leave. I'm almost certain he did that because he didn't want us to see him die, and he wanted to go to the massive forest area and do his thing. I miss you, buddy. I was stalked by a mountain lion when I was young. My family was ahead of me, and I saw it in a tree watching me. I yelled forward to my parents, and when I looked back, it was gone. I was under 10 at the time, and am almost 40 now. I don't even know if it was real anymore. I was at the airport and saw a businessman with a carry-on wheelie bag get off the escalator. He turned the corner, broke into a sprint, carrying the bag by its small strap handle on top. He swung the bag forward and let go of the strap handle. While it was in midair, he grabbed the currently unextended extending handle, pressed the button, and on the backswing, extended the handle, landing it on its wheels as he continued sprinting, all without breaking stride. When I was a kid, I'd sometimes get up in the middle of the night and go downstairs to get a drink or snack. On the way, I had to pass by this dark hallway that led to my dad's office. I was always scared to look down that hallway at night because I had this fear that I was going to see a small child standing there. I have no idea where the thought came from, outside of my hyperactive imagination. Well, fast forward many years, and my wife, kids, and I are staying in that house during a visit. My daughter is sleeping in my dad's office. As you may have already figured out, one night I'm heading down to get a snack. I look down that hallway as I pass by it, and what do I see? My child standing there. Scared the crap out of me. I saw one of the modified stealth helicopters that were used in the Bin Laden raid. I used to live near McChord Air Force Base growing up. During the 90s, we'd occasionally see an F-117 or B-2 flying during the day. But one night in 09 or 10, I was hanging out on the shore of a lake doing teenage things and heard something weird. I was along a flight path and near the aforementioned airbase, so I was used to planes and helicopters flying past. I'm familiar with what Chinooks and MH-60s sound like, but this was different. Something was off. That's when I saw 2 helicopters with normal lights break through the tree line. I assumed they were Apaches, but it was dark, so I'm just guessing there. However, between them was a 3rd helicopter with no lights at all, almost like the other 2 were escorting it. I know it's incredibly rare for any aircraft to be granted permission to fly with no lights. And again, it sounded weird. I could differentiate between the normal thwump-thwump of the 2 escorts and the mysterious 3rd craft that had a much more muffled thwip-thwip. Anyways, in 2011, SEAL Team 6 crashed one of their modified stealth helicopters during the bin Laden raid, and they had to acknowledge that the Comanche program wasn't as dead as we were led to believe. Ever since then, I've been convinced that's what I saw that night a few years prior. Two foxes ice skating on a frozen pond. My mom and brother saw it too. We watched for a good 10 minutes or more, sometimes on their hind legs, sometimes not. But they were definitely playing together and enjoying sliding around. I was at my parents', sitting in the living room. They have a dog, and I was looking at her, waiting for her to give me her attention. After a few minutes, she looked at me. I wanted to teach her something unnecessary that my parents would wonder about later. I began to raise my eyebrows. She looked at me still. I did it more often, and she was still very curiously looking at me. I went on raising my eyebrows over and over again for at least a few minutes. After staring at me for a really long time, she suddenly raised her eyebrows. I found it so funny and couldn't believe she really copied me. When I told my family, no one believed me, and my parents' dog would not do it again. This was 3 years ago, and from time to time I sit in front of her, raising my eyebrows. But nothing. Went jogging at 5 a.m., and I stopped to say a prayer at a statue in front of the church. There was an old lady praying too, so I stopped by her side, closed my eyes, and then I heard the old lady crying. When I opened my eyes to check, she was nowhere to be found. I thought I'd imagined her or something and started jogging again, only to hear something behind me. I turned back and looked, and there she was, staring at me. I ran as fast as I could. It was the most intense jog I'd ever had, though. At work on the railroad, going down the main line at 40 miles per hour, in the middle of the day in the woods, I watched a massive thing leap from one tree line to the other, completely clearing a span of about 30 feet without touching the ballast. It was on all fours and muscular, bear-shaped but much bigger, and its skin was fleshy pink. I jumped out of my seat when I saw it. My engineer didn't, as he was looking at me while talking. I told him what I saw and described it, expecting to get some teasing about it. To my surprise, he told me that 2 weeks before, a different conductor he was working with saw the same thing in the exact same area. I never heard another thing about it. In 2012, I lived in the Midwest near an Air Force base. I delivered newspapers in the early morning hours to make extra money. At 4 o'clock one morning, a drone started shadowing me on my route. Not a tiny drone like today. This thing was big and way up in the air. I saw it through my sunroof, and I could hear it humming. It followed me for blocks. I got out of my car to make a porch delivery, and when I looked up at it, it flew off. It still creeps me out. My story takes place in the northeastern U.S. I was about 6 or 7 years old, which might make the story difficult to believe, but I have many other solid memories from that age, as do others. It would have been in the early 2000s. I was with my mom and her boyfriend at the time, and we went to visit one of his friends. Their house was in a very rural area, surrounded by thick forest on either side. I had never been there before. The friend was already outside, so the adults started chatting in the driveway. Being bored with their conversation and more interested in the thick woods around us, I wandered off into them. I got maybe 70 to 100 feet in when I started feeling strange, the whole being watched thing, goosebump sensations and all. I chalked it up to just being creeped out because the forest was so thick that it blocked out a good portion of sunlight, darkening the area. I pushed on a few more feet, maybe 5 or 10, when all of a sudden I heard fast and heavy rustling in the trees ahead of me, but far enough away that I couldn't actually see the trees moving. I paused to listen until I realized the rustling was coming at me, and fast. It got to where I could actually see the trees moving in a zigzag pattern, as if something fairly large was jumping from tree to tree toward me. I pictured in my mind a baboon showing its fangs, and fight or flight kicked in, so I turned and ran out of there. I heard whatever this was crashing through the trees behind me for a few seconds, and then it stopped when I was just a few feet from the friend's driveway. It was one of the most frightening experiences of my life. I remember I could still feel the tingles of fear on my arms and the back of my neck as I stood in the driveway processing what had just happened. I don't know what I experienced that day, but it definitely wasn't a squirrel. When I was about 4, I was at my grandma's house and wandered off into her bedroom, where I met an old lady with dyed purple hair sitting on the bed. I vividly remember her and her purple hair. She introduced herself as my great-grandma Adriana, and we exchanged a few words before I wandered off again and kind of forgot about it. Years later, when I was 16, I noticed a picture of her with her purple hair on the wall at my grandma's house. I remembered the moment from when I was young and said, "Hey, that's my great-grandma Adriana." My mom asked, "Yeah, how do you know that?" I told her I met her when I was little and remembered her specifically by her purple hair. My mom, looking confused, said, "She always dyed her hair purple because she hated when it went gray, but she died before you were born." I used to drive really late nights all the time because of a tough job. It was a 1.5-hour commute each way, and sometimes I would get off work at 1:30 in the morning. One day I was driving through a stretch of road that was just trees with no buildings or houses nearby. I saw a guy in a trench coat and a hat walking, but it almost looked like he was walking in slow motion. He had a really great gait where his trench coat flowed with each step. Then, about 100 feet past him, I saw a guy running. I either saw a vampire out for a hunt, a movie bad guy like Jason or Michael Myers, where they walk while the victims run, or maybe a really cool mafia guy taking out a hit. I like to think it was a vampire. This happened years ago. My wife and I were moving cross-country in the U.S., and we'd spent a couple of nights at her grandparents' place in Topeka, Kansas, which is on the far east side of the state. We left after a couple of days of snow. It was a little cloudy, but there was no fog, and we were driving across the width of Kansas to Colorado, where we'd be staying with my grandma for a couple of days. Less than 5 miles outside Topeka, we were swallowed by the thickest, densest fog I've ever experienced, including when I regularly drove through fog-heavy Half Moon Bay in California. There was no one on our side of the highway, and no one was coming the other direction. For hours. For the first 3 to 4 hours, maybe one car passed going the other direction. It was just thick, thick fog. We pulled aside once, not even to get gas, just to get snacks and to use the restroom, and the gas station was lit up, but there were no cars parked around it. And we could see inside, and there were no people inside. We watched for about 10 to 15 minutes. There were no signs of life. We ended up just leaving because it was so eerie. I cannot express enough how empty it was. When we talk about it, we usually call it Silent Kansas after the Silent Hill games, because there was just nothing but the thick fog and a sense of foreboding. We drove for hours across Kansas, and the fog did not lift or lessen, and we did not see another living being. There were no signs, which I know are usually there, for gas stations and restaurants. It was just empty nothingness in the fog. And then we crossed the state border into Colorado, and within like 2 miles, before even hitting the mountains, so we were at the same altitude as we'd been before hitting Colorado, the fog was gone. The sky was clear and blue, and there were multiple cars on the highway going both directions. We both experienced it, but we will never be able to prove it happened because it was before the era of ubiquitous smartphones, and neither of us had the ability to record it at the time. It remains one of the most terrifying and inexplicable experiences I've ever had. When I was a kid, probably 12 years old, I was out cycling without my phone. While I was riding over a bridge in the countryside, I saw something huge down by the riverbed. I stopped, got closer, and I swear to God it was a 2-meter, about 7 feet long leech or a worm or something on the ground, slowly moving towards the river. I rushed home to get my phone to take a photo, but by the time I got back, it was gone. I still have no idea what the hell that was or where it ended up going, but it was there that day 10 years ago. Edit. Just for reference, the river itself is only 5 meters wide and in parts narrower. For context, it's in Croatia, not a humid tropical country where something like this might realistically happen. It couldn't have been a snake because, for one, we don't have big snakes here, and it didn't slither like a snake. It squished itself and then extended like a worm does. Came back from dinner with my then girlfriend, now wife, and our friend to our friend's house. The friend said, "Shh," and we crept up to the window next to the front door. Her chocolate lab was laying asleep on the couch that he wasn't allowed on. She jiggled the doorknob for a few seconds before unlocking the door and opening it. We went in to find the dog across the room in his dog bed pretending to be asleep. She went over and woke him up. He looked at all of us like he'd just woken up, sleepily started wagging his tail, and got up to stretch. One of the funniest things I've ever seen, and proof that he was smarter than half the humans I've met in my life. If we had that on camera, we would have definitely won the 100K on AFHV. The ghost of a War of 1812 era in broad daylight in my mom's backyard when I was about 35. Yes, I was wide awake. I was reading in a lounge chair. He was only there long enough for me to say, "Oh, you startled me." He wasn't frightening, and by the time my brain clued in, he was gone. The house was in Toronto, and he was gazing in the direction of Grenadier Pond. He looked troubled, like he had a lot on his mind. To this day, I wish I knew exactly who he was. 2. A crow, walking along the sidewalk, stopped at the corner and actually looked both ways before crossing the street. There wasn't even any traffic. 3. A fairy. Yes, a fairy. I was walking along a path next to a creek near my house, and I saw this thin, brownish humanoid figure about 6 or 7 inches tall jump onto a tree branch about 10 feet away from me. But when I tried to actually look at it, it was like I couldn't focus my eyes on it, or even on just that part of the tree. I was unnerved and got the heck out of there. I used to go there often for walks, and I never had an experience like that before or since. I saw a fracture in this dimension. I was waiting for the bus. I turned my head and saw the bus approach with a white pickup in front of it, so I looked forward and stood up. I turned my head again to wave the bus down, and there was a vertical line extending to infinity, like looking at the edge of a piece of glass. I thought my vision was going weird and that I was going to have a stroke or something, but I was perfectly fine. The bus drove through the line, and the line disappeared, but the pickup was gone. I looked up and down the street, but there was no sign of the pickup. There were no turnoffs or side streets, nothing. I got on the bus and looked out of every window as I walked down the aisle. The pickup was nowhere to be seen. I saw what I can only describe as seeing a star dying. Sometime back before 2015, not exactly sure when, my brother had a friend over for a sleepover. Because of this, we were sleeping in the living room that night. We lived out in the country, so the night sky was very clear, and our living room had very large windows facing away from the urban glow. I couldn't sleep, so I was just staring out at the stars. Then I saw one of the stars I was looking at erupt. It formed a large, thick ring that expanded to several times its original size. Then it very quickly stopped and collapsed back in on itself and vanished. Honestly, I know it doesn't make any sense for it to have really been a star exploding and then collapsing, but that's what it looked like. I still have no idea what it really was. My cat was meowing strangely in my kitchen at night, so I went over, and there was some sort of orange, bioluminescent, glowing creature that was about the size of a coin. I chased it across the floor of my living room, and at one point, it crawled over my hand and clung to my finger briefly. It felt like a mixture of an arachnid and an amphibian somehow. I froze and didn't know what to do, and then it kept going. It got away into some junk in my foyer, and I couldn't find it. A few minutes later, I saw 2 green glowing dots like laser pointers on the wall slowly following each other from the living room into the foyer. Then they stopped, and one faded out, and then the other faded out. To this day, I have no idea what happened, but I remember it vividly, and no one believes me. I would be inclined to think I was crazy if my cat hadn't seen the creature first. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more.